their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help.
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
Good morning, Arizona, and welcome to our listeners from around the globe. My name is Joe Brett.
I am David Lucier, and welcome
to the Veterans Heritage Hour.
Yes.
We have a great show for you today. We have two guests who are with the New America Foundation, and they'll be talking about New America and the Center for the Study of the Future of War. No?
Center on the Future of War.
Center on the Future of War. This is Daniel Rothenberg, who was our guest, and I'm going to cue in right now Lorelei Kelly. She's in Washington, D.C. We'll get her online here. But before we introduce our guest more formally, David and I have a little cleanup here to do. Our guest from last week or 2 weeks ago, Colonel James Kelsey, gave me some advice that we seemed in our last show, David and I, in our attempt to set it up a perfect show for you and Lorelei. Evidently it came across, hey, Lorelei, this is Joe Brett. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, okay. Before I introduce you formally, I'm just happy that you're able to make it from D.C. Daniel Rothenberg is sitting across from me, and I'm with David Lucier, my co-host. But we're just, last week we were trying to set up this three-session show on think tanks and New America and what's going on and what are some of the issues that hopefully we'll be talking about more in depth today. And in the process of that, we may have been skewed a little bit by suggesting that only Republicans or the GOP has these types of think tanks, et cetera. And that's certainly not the case. And so we'll get into that today. But I just wanted to clarify that David and I, the purpose for this show really is to discuss and to take a look at the issues surrounding war, who goes to war. And David and I work with a lot of students, and they look up to veterans and we look up to veterans. But we want to give them a fair shake and let them know the nuances involved with how wars and how we get into conflict and how those decisions are made and who makes those decisions.
So true to our mission of bringing the listening audience to about military history, but also then how does that segue into the future of warfare?
Exactly. And so we have with us today two great guests, and I think, David, the rest of the show, we just have to get out of the way and let these great speakers inform us here. Sitting across from me is...
The question is a really important one, and I'm glad you're bringing it up. It isn't so much a partisan issue, it's how their purpose, how they were founded, and how comfortable they are acting within political spaces. And there's real different flavors of think tanks. And so it really isn't a GOP versus Democrats thing. It's how they're organized and how they use their knowledge as influence.
I hear you. And so David and I were just...
It is really an interesting, and it can't break down very easily on party lines.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. Let me introduce Daniel Rothenberg. Daniel is a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies. He's also the co-director, the Center on the Future of War. He's a Lincoln Fellow for Ethics and International Human Rights Law at the University of Arizona. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure having you here. And Lorelei Kelly, I don't know what title to give you. Last time I met Lorelei several months ago in Boston. And at that time you were in California. Now you're in Washington, D.C.
Actually, I grew up in California, but I've been in D.C. for more than a decade. And I am a fellow with XLab, which is a technical and technology group incubated at the New America Foundation. So I hang out with the geeks and the wonks at the same time, which is a new development in think tanks.
So let me start with Daniel. Daniel, you spent several years in Iraq and Afghanistan working on human rights issues and rule of law issues. Can you just describe that briefly?
Sure. I was in Iraq back and forth in Iraq and the U.S. and other sites from 2004 to 2010, running human rights and rule of law projects in my capacity, working at the International Human Rights Law Institute at DePaul University College of Law.
Wow. And Lorelei, I read in your bio that when the wall fell, you were in Berlin.
I was a student, and I was actually working fortuitously. I was doing academic work in East Germany a lot of the time, and so I got really swept up in the underground democracy movement of the time, and then it was taking books over into the underground library system. And so I did that a lot throughout Eastern Europe. Have some good stories to tell about getting thrown off trains and put in detention, but
Not you.
we can get to that another time.
So then you, were you in grad school at the time?
It wasn't. It was right after college, and so
At Stanford, or your degree from Stanford, or?
This was actually, I went to a wonderful liberal arts school in Iowa called Grinnell College, and I had a fellowship called the Watson Fellowship, which allows about 70 students every year to pursue an independent project. And the only two rules we had was stay out of the USA and stay out of jail. And so.
And you broke rule 2.
They didn't know about that until a long time later. And I ended up being in Eastern Europe during this sort of the end of an era. And what's interesting is, like, people call it a revolution after it happened. While I was there, it was just a lot of citizens getting very tired of a stubborn, old, abusive regime. And it happened very differently in every single country. And I spent most of my time in Hungary, East Germany, sometime in the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. So Berlin was the beating heart of sort of Western democratic idealism in that space. So of course I ended up there.
So fast forward for us just a moment and tell us about today's adventures.
Well, I grew up went to high school in northern New Mexico with horses and dogs and extended family. And so it's kind of unusual that I am now a foreign policy, national security wonk in DC. I went to Stanford in the 90s, and a good friend of mine, in fact, my best friend, was elected to Congress. She's a South African naturalized American citizen in Portland, Oregon. And after a couple of years in DC, she called me up, and I was teaching at Stanford in the sort of conflict resolution decision analysis program, and said, listen, we desperately need somebody out here to organize ways to share information in the informal part of Congress, which is members networks and relationships between staffers, because the Congress itself, the committee system, which sorts and filters incoming information, is really still set up to reflect 1947, if not earlier. And after 1995, Congress, through its own actions with the leadership, and at that time it was Newt Gingrich and a new change of party rule, really eliminated a lot of the ways that members of Congress and staff informed themselves. And so it was the trusted information system inside of Congress that was abolished, and that included over 100 science experts and a lot of staff that were shared. To your point of why think tanks, especially ideologically aligned think tanks, have become so influential in DC, is because they're filling a vacuum that was purposely created in the 90s and which has never really been remedied. And certainly at this point, the congressional branch of government can't compete with the executive branch, and it also can't compete with the news media. And so a lot of what I've been working on since I left working in Congress is how do you rebuild a trusted information support system for Congress.
Okay, so hold that thought for just a second, Lorelei, and we'll get to Daniel. And he transitioned from the similar pattern, working on human rights, rule of law, to get into now the study on the future of war. How did that transition happen for you? How did you get involved with New America?
Oh, well, so the question on the issue is that most of my work on international human rights had to do with atrocities.
Sure.
So fairly serious violations. I worked on the Guatemalan Truth Commission, which, came to the determination that genocide was committed by the state against indigenous peoples in the country during the early 1980s. I've done similar various documentation and analysis projects in war zones. And so, and with, and documenting the practices of repressive regimes in various places. So that sort of work often has a great deal to do with conflict. Either it's in a conflict zone or the practices of states that engage in routine and systematic human rights violations. They're often authoritarian governments. They often exercise power in a way that has a lot to do with war, and that links to sort of militarized, either formally militarized governments or governments that use a very strong military intelligence system to suppress their people. In any case, so all of that is quite closely linked to a lot of what's going on in terms of war and conflict, in the sense that really in the second half of the 20th century and on into the 21st century, a lot of the wars and conflicts in the world are not standard interstate conflicts between large standing armies fighting against each other, but rather they're circumstances where the concerns of international human rights, trying to protect fundamental rights that individuals have, to not be tortured, to have freedom of expression, all of these, to have basic access to rule of law and governance and due process protections. So in those environments, the seeking to understand what war and conflict is it matches very well with making sense of human rights claims. And then, of course, doing work in these formal war zones, Afghanistan and Iraq, is just, especially in the United States, it's sort of the natural lead-in into trying to make sense of the future of war.
And that the rule of law that you're involved with, was it the law that got you into the study of drones and the laws related to the use of drones? Was it that hooked you into the study of drones?
Actually, my interest in drones came from just spending a lot of time in these places where drones were being used quite extensively before they became a public issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I first came to Arizona State University, I was asked by the dean, what would you like to do? And I said, I really wanted to do a major conference on drones. And this gets to the second question, which is, how did you start working with New America?
Mm-hmm.
So ASU's had a long-standing relationship with New America, and the head of the International Security Program, Peter Bergen, was at the time doing something really exceptional that shows the sort of flexibility and capacity of think tanks to substantively contribute to public debate. So at the time, there was very little public information about the drone program, particularly the covert drone program in northern Pakistan. The government was not acknowledging such a program existed.
Our government.
The US government. Yeah. And so what Peter did at the time, and his team, was gather news reports and then collate them so that you would get sort of the best possible data on drone strikes and where they were taking place and who they were against and what their impact was. In any case, so at the same time as I was interested in doing a sort of international legal engagement with drones because they present lots of questions, Peter and his team were doing this documentation of these violations. We ended up doing a big conference in DC that led to a book and kind of an ongoing relationship. And I can say it's just an absolute pleasure to link ASU and New America.
I think our book is here in our set, and also it's on our website. If you want to look at the book, we're reading the book, Drone Warfare. It sounds like it's, bullets and lasers and things, but it's pretty wonkish. It's pretty factual, and it's pretty well written, very well written, and very concise analysis of how drones are used and their efficacy, and a lot of statistics involved in that, in the book. Lorelei, how did you get involved with New America?
I went to New America a couple of years ago because a good friend of mine, who I knew from the national security world, was working with the technology group there called the Open Technology Institute. And what ended up happening is he connected me with both Peter Bergen and Steve Cole, who is a national security author, has written some wonderful books, who's now at Columbia Journalism School, so journalist, and Peter. And they put me in between the technology and the national security program. And I think that makes perfect sense, because one of the reasons I left Capitol Hill was because this was after, during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, I figured that unless we change the way we talk about these foreign policy issues, we're not going to be able to change the content of the issues and how we talk about war and peace and how the information comes to Congress and the architecture around that. And that's what I've been looking at for the last 3 years with the technology group. But I see them fundamentally linked.
So you have a top security clearance, and you were a staffer in the Senate, were you not?
I was on the House side
Okay.
mostly. I did work a lot with the Senate, but what happened with me is unusual. I was asked to come to D.C. by a group of members of Congress, and I was put on different staffs to run a program underneath the committee system in both the House and Senate. I had a partner in the Senate who was on a Republican staff. I was on Democratic staff, and we shared everything. What we did was create a shared information sharing system on national security foreign policy. And the requirement was really that it just had to be something that was new and post-Cold War, and that our foreign policy professionals and civil society were working on together. And like my informal rule was like, we weren't going to just create another venue for lobbyists and the defense industry, but really the people who we were deploying, civilians and military, to take these risks on behalf of our foreign policy. That was the idea, was to create a special protected conversation space inside Congress. And to me, that's really at the heart of deliberation and oversight, is how is your policy being carried out by the people we are putting at risk? And of course, this is a lot of the military, but it's increasingly been civilians and civil society. That's the State Department and all the international non-governmental organizations in a world where access to violence and sort of the role of boundaries and constraints in the former world no longer exists.
Yes, that's certainly true. War is things moving to the Ethernet, and targeting seems to be more individualistic now. I mean, I was a forward air controller running airstrikes, etc., and David did it more intimately. But the targeting, it seems, when we went after the Koreans, we didn't go after Korea. We went after like 5 guys and shut down their internets for a few days. I mean, we're moving into cyber warfare. That seems to be a predictable nuance, I guess, of future wars. But also with the Russians, when they went into Ukraine, we didn't go after Russia per se. I mean, we put sanctions on them, but we went after the accounts of 5 or 6 guys that are around Putin. So the targeting seems to be much different. We have lasers now that can take out individuals without interfering with the governments. And if you take out a building, what have you taken out if the information is all in the cloud? So there's a big targeting difference I'm noticing, and more reliance on cyber warfare. Would you say that was true, Daniel? Is that how you're looking at this, the future?
I mean, there's lots of ways to look at targeting, but certainly targeting is shifting, and there's even some interesting research and writing now about the idea that the classic distinctions, so in international humanitarian law, the laws of war, what the U.S. military calls the law of armed conflict, or LOAC, the classic targeting system is based on distinction, that, that's the reason militaries wear uniforms, so that they can be distinguished from civilians. So they can be targeted, whereas civilians cannot be legally targeted. So in a whole set of ways, that classic understanding of who can be targeted is shifting. It's shifting both because there's an incredible advance in precision weaponry, and coupled with that is this whole intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance revolution, which is really a lot of what drones are. They're actual. They're
connected to that.
They're completely connected. So, and then added to this are massive amounts of information. So you start to see actual shifts in targeting. I'll give you a really concrete example. What's known as signature strikes by drones, just to be concrete, is we have what are called personality strikes, where the individual or set of individuals who's targeted their identities are known and their dossiers about who they are and what they've been up to. A signature strike is a classic example of the direction in which targeting is potentially moving, moving in, which is a collection of different information that indicates that a person or set of people fit a category that can be legitimately targeted. You don't know who they are. They don't wear clearly distinguishing uniforms of the enemy in classic IHL, meeting classic IHL standards. And as we move forward to a data-rich world with all sorts of collating of information, whether it's publicly available information or information gathered covertly, the idea that people can be targeted by the signatures they leave is a radical new understanding of what war means. And then when you expand the war zone to, say, anywhere where one understands these threatening individuals to be located, you really move into a place where war means something quite different than what we've traditionally understood it to mean.
And Lorelei, I mean, given what Daniel just said, Are these kinds of definitions being communicated through the halls of Congress?
Well, from my experience working on the Hill, Congress came to, this urgent need to understand war differently, a good 10 years after we started being involved in all these out of mission or out of agency responsibility activities. And one of the things I saw happen consistently for almost a decade when I was on the Hill was the migration of policy from civilians to military committees like armed services or intelligence. You can see this with the NSA surveillance over collection problem, is that a Congress that's set up to look backward in time or to be inspired by the last century for how you understand the world can't sort, filter, or handle the complex emerging kinds of problems we're dealing with today that also happen in real time, that happen not just sequentially, but simultaneously in a world that is increasingly linked rather than ranked. I mean, the Soviet Union versus the United States is a pretty easy recipe for a lens on the world. And today, Congress, I do think individual members of Congress really do get this and are struggling within their assignments and in this obsolete and incapacitated structure. And so, yeah, I feel like these are huge issues. And one of the problems I've had with how we understand security is the most progressive we've gotten is just what is the difference between policing and military use of force, when actually I think
so Lorelei, we have to take a short break here. We'll pick that up when we come back, and we want to hear more about that. We also want to hear how you think, and you wrote about how Congress got a lobotomy or lobotomized itself. And Daniel, we certainly want to discuss more on your work with the future of war. We'll be right back. You're listening to Vets on Media, and this is the Veterans Heritage Hour.
Veterans served us, now it's time we serve them. As a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a current military member deployed abroad, I would like to take a minute of your time to tell you about Patriot Hills of New York. Patriot Hills of New York is a nonprofit organization providing support to veterans and their families. They partner veterans in need with over 65 health and wellness organizations, community groups, as well as philanthropic foundations providing no or low-cost services. They've helped over 400 veterans through confidential referral services, assistance with veterans issues, employment placement, as well as educational opportunities. If you need assistance or just want to help veterans by donating your time or services, contact them at info@patriothills.org. Again, that's info@patriothills.org. Visit patriothillsofnewyork.com for more information about their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help. Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey, everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful they can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm and his dedicated staff take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling him today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing that he'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552. or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face-to-face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets on Media Network.
Hey, you're back to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We have Lorelei Kelly on the phone from Washington, D.C. Lorelei, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am.
Great. Can you just pick up where we left off with you? You were describing.
Sure. I think even the most sort of progressive voices in this conversation about where we are and what is our strategy, it's still sort of always a choice between what use of force. Is it going to be policing or is it going to be the military? And we actually, I think, need to even get beyond that to figure out how do we, if we can, create the conditions which allow people who are making decisions in their own lives about who they're going to identify with, choose to identify with what we value, which is rule of law and human rights and inclusive societies and societies that prosper because of collaboration. I don't know if we're going to get there, but what I witnessed in Congress was the continual debilitation of the civilian side of our government, and that's in foreign policy, the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And for a lot of reasons, I don't think these big monolithic institutions can do that work anymore. So that's a double challenge for us.
Are they contracting that work out?
I actually don't think that contractors, which follow sort of a commercial model or an advertising model to solve problems, is the answer either. I do think that the flexibility and the agility that commercial participants provide is very helpful for certain roles. But that whole sort of division of labor breakdown of what is appropriate to outsource and what has to be fundamentally accountable to the public interest, I don't think we've had a thorough evaluation of what that means today. And so, yes, I feel that the sort of old leftover, there's a military industrial complex here, there's a humanitarian industrial complex, now there's a secrecy economy that prospers in Washington, D.C. And those are all really hampering our ability to get our heads above the fog and take risks and start to think about entirely new and different ways to handle emergent issues.
Well, there's an emergent issue
and threats.
There's an emergent issue in front of us today, it seems. We just had President Netanyahu speak before our Congress, and now we have 47 senators writing a letter to Khomeini in Iran, suggesting that we're not going to pass an attempt at a peace treaty or a nuclear disarmament treaty. And that seems to me, and David, that there's a lot of, people are writing checks that are going to have to be cashed by the blood, sweat, and tears of our American servicemen. And that's our concern. Who speaks for us? Who speaks for the kids that are going to have to back up this? Are they going to have to go to war in Iran? That's our thought. Who was the think tank? Who would be the advisors that you would think? Open question here. Who would you think is the think tank responsible for the GOP policy of going hard on Iran? And maybe is this a part of the ploy to get into the White House in 2016? Is this all a game being played? And are we writing checks that American soldiers are going to have to cash? That's a question. Lorelei, or anybody?
Take that first if you want to. I mean, I can give my impressions on it, but yeah, I think that there's definitely what's going on here. There's different levels of looking at this. Like what I would say to the Republicans in Congress is, listen, like if you want to go, mano a mano with the executive branch on foreign policy and national security, why do you keep lobotomizing yourself? Like, why do you keep ruining your capacity as an institution, as the first branch of government, to have the internal resources and knowledge and ability through your institutional functions, which is, investigation and deliberation and oversight? Congress is doing 50% less hearings today as it did 10 years ago.
Not on Benghazi. There's a lot of hearings on Benghazi.
Well, it's a case in point of how it's not just issue capture now, it's process capture for political purposes. That's how I looked at that. There were so many special investigations, and there's now another ongoing investigation. At some point, we need a group of people who can stand up for institutions, and I can one of those. They're public-serving, accountable institutions. And I think the way to influence members of Congress is veterans themselves organizing in a way that's comfortable for them within their professional boundaries. And that's always been an issue for military.
Well, we hope to be the voice for those people here.
I'd like to weigh in on something that you said. You mentioned whether there's sort of a process of writing checks, or which I think you meant setting up a circumstance where others will pay the cost.
And I think James Fallows mentioned Chicken Hawk Nation. I think he's a New America fellow. And he mentioned there's a urge for warfare, but with someone else doing the fighting. And he mentioned that in his Atlantic piece a couple months ago.
Well, so right now there's a very small percentage of the U.S. population that's in
less than 1%.
Yes,
but they're going to have to. Well, they went 4 and 5 times to Iraq and Afghanistan. The deployment was overwhelming for them.
But I would raise a larger point about cost, which is one of the striking things. We're coming on nearly a decade and a half of these complex, large-scale foreign conflicts, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, and wherever else this is going. And throughout this period of time, there's been almost a complete disengagement with the idea of the cost of war. And this is true, and as a thought experiment, I would just say, because cost can mean a lot of different things.
Sure,
there's more than one kind of cost.
I'm talking about blood.
There's the people who put their lives at risk and may be killed. There's the people who are severely wounded.
Those are the costs.
Rippling effects through.
Yes.
But then there's also all the other complex costs that go along with the entire process, right?
Sure.
Whether it's caring for people who come back from combat or just paying for the complex, extremely expensive process of fighting wars. So throughout this process, though, there's been a disengagement of the American public with the costs of war at almost every level.
Sure.
And just as a thought experiment, to make cost focused, because it can mean a lot of things. Sure. How would the U.S. people feel about a conflict if they were asked to pay for it directly? Let's just say if there was a surtax on the annual income tax, presented to all taxpayers of 5% a year for the duration of conflict A, whether it's Iraq, whether it's some future conflict with Iran. I bring that up not as an actual policy recommendation, but it gives, I think, a window into how different the process of going to war might be for our society if people felt like the cost was something that affected them personally. Because
the term is always used, the term that we've always hear is skin in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
And investing in, this particular course of action. What does it really mean? What's it going to really cost you? And that is, maybe a small cost in the overall scheme of things. It certainly is a little bit more than, I guess, what you would describe as what's the word I'm looking for here? It's more than just standing up and saying, we're for this or we're against it. It actually makes you stand up and pay a price, which is important.
Well, that's Thomas Ricks, another one of your fellows too, who said there's no accountability. What's Generals? He was in his book Generals, and his conversation at the Cronkite School mentioned there's no penalty for failure. People, step out of office, go to the World Bank, or they go back to academia, or they do something, or the generals get relieved, but they don't, they stay in and they keep their retirement. There's no substitute. There's no penalty. It doesn't seem. Is that part of the study that you're looking at in the future of war? Who's going to fight the future wars if the VA is broken and we keep on sending troops to fight wars that we're not winning, and there's no support for them when we get back home? Are we going to run out of volunteers?
Interestingly, that has not been
the story
in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, you might think that would be an outcome of this long period of conflict, but in fact, that isn't, for reasons that maybe don't have a simple explanation.
Sure.
But I mean, certainly one of the issues in our Future of War project and in ASU's Center on the Future of War is to explore, the various ways in which war and conflict are changing globally, but also as a point of reflection for the United States at this time period, which is where so much is going on, and it's not always easy to insert into the public space a reasonable discussion, even of very pressing questions. Oftentimes it's very reactive. So like the discourse on ISIS now is enormously reactive to the news of the moment, rather than reflective on the fact that, the U.S. presence in the region is enormously defining of conditions on the ground, et cetera. So, but broadly, I think that, as comes out in the Fallows piece and as comes out in Tom Ricks, one of our Future of War team members, is that there's a talk in a democratic society that going to war is one of the most serious acts, and that it ought to be something that sort of cuts to the heart of the commitment and vision and sacrifice of the nation. And yet the practice of war has often been structured so that only a very small percentage of the population has skin in the game, as you say. And it's a question for our society whether that's the right way to manage war and conflict. There are advantages to that.
Yes.
It makes it easier for certain kinds of actions to be implemented, but it similarly has a social cost, and I'm not sure that we can easily assess the social cost because that goes on, that reverberates for generations.
Well, there is go ahead, David.
Oh, I was just going to say that kind of getting back to, if you will, Lorelei's position about really redefining what's going on, what's going on today, and then of course when you're looking into the future, the past doesn't seem to be much help here, and so we need to redefine entire environments, entire rationales, because the situation has changed again. And I think Daniel is struck on it. We don't have big armies facing each other in these kind of conflicts. They're non-state players. The whole battlefield has changed, and so it would seem to me that we would need to change our definition in order to change our direction. And how does Congress do that? And I think Lorelei, you're talking about that today and ongoing. So what is the future look like, and how do we get there? How do we make these redefinitions? How do we do that, Lorelei?
Well, part of I just read a piece about the Netanyahu speech, and I feel like it was an insult to the executive branch just to not share that visit. Right there says something in politics, but also the audience at the speech inside of Congress was indicative. Sheldon Adelson, which is a billionaire who's funded very hard right positions on Israel and cultivated that, as well as on Iran, was one of the people there. And to me, that is the more mysterious and ominous part for a representative democracy, is when just a handful of people start to create an atmosphere for governing that is transactional, in the sense that
Well, you've just described the classic oligarchy. You've just described the classic oligarchy. Have you not?
I like to not use that word. I like to call it more like, it's very cartel-like in an information sense. It's who provides the information and who provides the outcome. I'm not cynical about Congress, actually. I really love the institution of Congress. And I think it's a miraculous institution in the way that it has endured and also been able to handle complexity and turn and bend and shape and move forward. I really worry that it's not a resilient democratic system right now, because there's a possible single point of failure, and that is the legislative branch. I don't feel comfortable with the executive branch collecting and amassing so much power. I do think a lot of it is the self-inflicted lobotomy that Congress has given itself. But what I work on right now is trying to find a way forward, and the technology advances, including technical upgrades inside of Congress. That's a committee hearing room, for example, today is the equivalent of a basic production studio. It wasn't like that 10 years ago. And there's also, at the same time, been transparency requirements implemented inside of law. And I think now it's finding a balance between these new spaces that are opened up inside Congress and the technology that allows us to decentralize whole functions like information provision and oversight and deliberation. There's no reason that field hearings, which happen in states and districts, couldn't become a very substantive way to impact policy deliberations. And I say this more in their formative stages. So what I'm interested in is, how do you broaden the sample of information that gets into policy at the formative stages? And what I'm up against is this sort of private market for influence that's developed and has been exacerbated by Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court ruling 5 years ago that allows unlimited amounts of money that's anonymous into the system. And that's impacted think tanks in a way that is significant to your original question, is that some think tanks now have PACs associated with them, which go after members in their district. The Heritage Foundation has done this. It's also been punished for this. The Heritage Foundation very successfully combined politics and policy for decades. It was founded in the early 70s and basically provided surrogate staffing for the Republican Study Committee.
So Daniel Rothenberg, given what Lorelei has just said, how do we react to that, and how do we predict, if you will, what we're going to do or what we should do in the future? That's hugely complex.
Surely there can't be a single answer to what we should do.
You're the guy, Daniel. We got you here for the one answer that's going to save the world. Come on, Daniel.
We want the subject and a verb here and a benefit.
I mean, certainly what Lorelei is saying that makes an enormous amount of sense is just the need for institutions to be able to be flexible. I mean, just to go back to a point that she made earlier, the system through which, say, contracts are let out for international development, in the case of USAID and State Department grants that relate to that. I say this as someone who's been a contractor from these agencies.
I have been a contractor as well.
So you know the story. Commonly, just as an example of a fundamentally unflexible system that isn't inflexible, right? Because of the ill intentions of the people within the system. It's just there's an enormous amount of bureaucratic structure to it. So, for example, you'll get, in the case of, say, a rule of law project, you'll get the terms created in Washington for a particular kind of project debated and discussed and then put down on paper. This is put out to bid, and then the contractors are responsible to respond to what they have agreed to do contractually.
Sure.
If the conditions on the ground are completely distinct, or if that was never exactly thought through the right way, or all the different communication breakdowns in the system, there's almost no space within all of that to address those problems. And the experience I've had has always been at a very micro level of this larger system, but it's a real challenge for all of our governing structures to be adequately flexible, to build into their systems of operation, whether it's funding or anything else, to be flexible enough to deal with real conditions as they change, instead of being committed to some vision that was determined in one moment, and then you have to stick with that vision until the next cycle, whether it's a funding cycle or a policy cycle of some other type.
So there are think tanks now getting into, New America. The talent. I mean, Fareed Zakaria is one of your advisors. I mean, he's, I think, arguably terrific. He's the guy on TV that I watch, and his guests are terrific, including Anne-Marie Slaughter, but Richard Hawes is on several times, and he brings in a wonderful group of thinkers to help us work through the issues of the day and what's really going on, because we don't get what's really going on, and the spin and the hype and the money, et cetera, that's out there to spin this thing one way or the other according to your political points of view. But it's possible now that we have a partisan war. You could have a Republican war versus a Democratic war, it would seem, based upon what's going on today, that there's a movement by a group to push for war in Iraq, and there's another group that wants to give peace a chance by negotiations and diplomacy, and there's two conflicting points of view here. I don't know what the tiebreaker is that, but it seems that we could be going war for a domestic conflict and not necessarily for something that's in our national interest. Do you see that at all? Is that
well, one of the stranger things about spending a lot of time in Iraq in the early years of the conflict is that the U.S. read, the way the war was presented in the United States, is enormously divided. The U.S. public was quite divided about whether invading Iraq was a good idea, and the management of the war. It was so partisan that even clear, rational engagements with what was happening on the ground were almost impossible to voice domestically. And I would argue that a lot of the management of the conflict was done with a vision towards how it would play in the U.S. And I'll give you the most concrete example that I felt when I was there was, to this day, the near complete absence of sort of traction in the public imaginary among the American people of an engagement with this place called Iraq, and with what this many years of conflict meant for Iraqis. I mean, the cost of that failure to engage the place is a subsequent extraordinary surprise when the central government turns out to disenfranchise a substantial portion of the population. And then the rise of various movements,
Sure.
ISIS, and its backing by different Sunni tribal groups where their backing exists. My point being, even with this enormous presence in this foreign country, somehow that didn't because of the partisan nature of that conflict, I think, or at least that's one of the reasons, It was enormously difficult for Americans to pay attention to the experience of Iraqis, and the cost of that failure to pay attention, produces all kinds of really substantial policy blunders.
And we get divided here, and we almost had adversarial reactions to people who think differently. It's divided society along those ways, but we ought to recognize that all the people who have been involved in Iraq or other conflicts or involved in our foreign policy are all honorable people. No one gets up in the morning and says, I want to screw up today. And, so they're all honorable people. They've all been recognized. They've all been public servants. And we ought to recognize that there are differences of opinion, and the opinion should matter, and not taking it out in a visceral reaction to one group or the other, which seems to happen now. It becomes personal attacks.
I have one concrete suggestion, actually. Oftentimes in discussions of foreign policy, there's a marked absence of data or in-depth facts. I don't mean just a factual statement. I mean, and the failure to create a kind of database, which we have for other areas. We have that for healthcare,
banking.
We have banking in more complex way, maybe.
Sure.
But I'm not saying that it's easy to come up with data and metrics for foreign policy issues, but some of them provide a kind of grounding for evaluating what takes place over time. And there's a striking lack of that. There's an enormous amount of emotion, anecdote, and the downside of that is it isn't grounded, so that the arguments then become largely based on ideology and not on sort of an engagement with what's really happening.
And Lorelei, that's your specialty, right?
Yeah, I mean, the moment that always sticks in my head was in 2003 when Eric Shisekki was the Army Chief of Staff, was Secretary of the Army, one of the others. It was talking about, what might happen in Iraq and our incapacity to occupy a country. And he named, in the hundreds of thousands of troops based on our experience in Germany and Japan. He was pulling from the Army's own institutional memory of occupation. And he was basically chased out and forced to retire. And what I always wonder is if there had been some really well-regarded, high-reputation data feeds on a screen behind him that showed, predictive modeling or probability modeling, I think is probably a better word for it, of what our experience has been and what means we're bringing to bear on an occupation and what likely outcomes could be by changing a few of the variables. And we have the ability to do that. 538, a news organization in New York, is doing that on all sorts of issues right now. But
548?
Pretty basic. Yeah, 538 is Nate Silver. He's the one that called the election last time around and sort of became famous for the quality of knowledge and the process behind knowledge. Is something that we can make much more visible today, even with new journalism tools, which provide, continuing feeds and slide rules and video outtakes of people who are actually on the ground experiencing a situation that's far more robust. I don't like that word. It's such an academic word, but it's a far more comprehensive combination of input.
Well, it seems to me that it's putting things in context. It's giving it a context. Is that a fair statement?
It's giving it facts.
Yeah, I mean, giving civilian elected leaders in legislatures the situational awareness tools that the military brings to bear for civilian purposes would be wonderful. That's what I'm hoping we can create with Congress and with these new technical upgrades. But the key with Congress is that it needs to be both accountable and competent in order to be resilient as a democracy. And so we have to build ways to compromise between demands for access, which are complicated by the money in the system and the loudest voices and ideology, the demands for access on the one side and the requirements of expertise. And how do you, in my view, we need some voices count more than others in decision making. Not all information is created equal. There's a difference between sentiment and substance. And that we can illustrate now using visual data or ways to create much more comprehensive context for decision making. And my hope is that if we're able to bring to bear the consequences of decisions, even though nothing's 100%, if we're able to illustrate that in real time, for example, that is a way to hold leaders accountable for using the best knowledge available in the moment. I don't know how effective fact-checking is ever going to be if it happens 48 hours later. I don't know what else we can bring to bear up against the amount of money in the system that can, impact the foreign policy of two different countries, Iran and the United States right now. It's thrown a huge wrench into that, although I think the response from Iran has been pretty good.
Yeah, there's a joke in the paper of Khomeini writing back saying he would broker a peace treaty between Obama and the Congress. Two long-term, enemies of long-standing.
Obama's trying to optimize the situation now with people, a network in place in Iran. The ruling cabinet in Iran has more American-educated people in it than I think almost any other country in the world. The people in the cabinet have attended school from Louisiana to California to Denver to MIT.
I just saw the other night to the University of Glasgow. There's a Caledonia Glasgow University where the foreign minister received a PhD. For Cal Berkeley, Cal Poly, MIT, etc. Listen, we got 5 minutes left. We got 4 minutes left, Lorelei. So let's get to Daniel. We're going to wrap this up here in the next 4 minutes. But a teaser to our audience: we have Cap Dean, who's going to be on our show. Cap Dean is a former State Department official, an AID worker, and he was a former mayor of Baghdad. So we're going to bring him in to talk about his feelings on the rule of law and how AID and how the State Department can work more effectively or has worked effectively in conflict. Next week, a retired three-star General David Frudovich, who was Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command, and he was a top Green Beret when he retired. He's worked around the world, including successful operations in the Philippines, and he has much to say. So with that said, Daniel, any thoughts on what are your immediate goals at the Center on the Future of War, study of the future of war?
Well, I think our main goal is to, one, deepen our relationship. We're building this relationship that links the really great folks at New America, and it is a top team. We have a whole team of future of war folks there. You've mentioned a number of them. They range from journalists to former special forces operators to people in various policy positions. And then we have over 90 affiliated faculty at Arizona State University. So we're trying to bring everyone together. It always is some kind of a challenge.
The end product is going to go to whom?
It's a series of products, right? So we just had our big Future of War, the first Future of War annual conference in Washington, D.C. with a 2-day conference. I know you could share with your listeners the schedule if you wanted.
Sure.
But we're putting out a series of different research products. And it's a diverse group, so we don't have a singular message. The idea is to weigh in productively on multiple different areas. In any case, and so that's our goal, and that's what we'll be doing for the remainder of this academic year and on into the next.
Will this be influencing governments or presidential candidates, or who is going to be reading or listening or ingesting this?
So to bring this back to your whole think tank question, think tanks are, you can look at them critically, you can look at them positively, just like universities. But one of the great things about our system is that there are a decent number of very intelligent idea producers that have access to significant audiences in DC and elsewhere. So our goal is to substantively contribute to debate. Ideally, in multiply the debate that goes on, in the popular forum, and debate that it goes on in the halls of Congress.
Well, we'll be watching. We love what you're doing here, and we absolutely thank you so much for including us in. And you've been more than gracious in letting us talk to Thomas Ricks and the speakers that come. So thank you. We hope this relationship continues.
And Lorelei, thank you very much. And
parting shots, Lorelei.
No, I wanted to say thank you for including me. I think that we're embarking on a whole new set of ideas and conversations, and I'm pretty hopeful about it.
Well, we are too. This is a podcast, so we'd hope that people would, we hope students and teachers can use this to further engage their world history classes, social studies classes. We have the Veterans Heritage Project, which engages students to talk to veterans. David and I are partial to veterans. We have each other's backs, and we love the people that we have in our veterans. We know them. We don't know politicians so much because you don't know whose back they have. And are we an afterthought sometimes? We don't know. So we're just a couple of guys who have been there a little bit, trying to add some guidance to those who are interested in the military, national security matters, and bringing the fine work that you're doing to a public that has a keen interest in.
Putting it into context.
Putting it into
Daniel
context.
Rothenberg. Thank you very much. Lorelei Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And we'll
you.
be back next week with David Frutovich, and stay tuned for more guests and more enlightening conversation. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, oh, the ramparts we watched were so